Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Chris Kraft, and I'm going to talk to you this afternoon on the topic of African Americans in the United States military. When I first talked with Margie Vogt, who organizes the presentations for the brown bag lunches, I had in mind doing this topic for this month, Black History Month. And the reason that I thought it was important to do this was because of a personal incident that occurred with me back in the 1990s when I was doing American Civil War living history. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the film Glory. Glory is a movie that was made in 1989 and focuses on the history of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. The 54th was one of the first African American regiments to be formed after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a very important regiment, and Glory tells a very important story. In order to film that movie, it was necessary for the film company to create a regiment of African American soldiers in the period of the American Civil War. And they did that by going around the country and recruiting college students, including several from Ohio State University. This was an eye-opening experience for these African American soldiers. They were trained by the film company, and they did a wonderful job in the movie. Many of them decided after that experience to continue doing American Civil War living history. It was my honor on several occasions to command battalions that included companies of those men. Then in the 1990s, we did a small living history event at Ohio Village down in Columbus. And I had the opportunity to sit down with one of these gentlemen and actually talk to him about his experience in filming Glory. And what he told me was very eye-opening. He told me that he had no idea that black troops served during the American Civil War. He had no connection with that history. And serving with the 54th Massachusetts in the filming of Glory changed his whole perspective about American history, about the role of African Americans in American history, and about his personal place in the history of this nation. So it was important for me to maybe pass that along through this brown bag lunch. Understand, I am in no way a professional historian. I am in no way an expert in this particular field. I did a lot of research for this presentation, and I learned a great deal. It is my hope that I can stimulate interest in you, the audience, to go out and research these things on your own, to find out more about your own personal history, about the relatives that you had that served in the Army, in the Navy, Air Force, and Marines throughout American history. It's important. It's very important. You see, African Americans have a long, rich, and proud heritage in the American military from the very beginning. The image that you're looking at is the death of Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was 47 years old in March of 1770. He was of mixed blood. He was African American and he was Native American. It's thought that he was an escaped slave and he had come to Boston to find a job. And he found a job on the docks as a stevedore, moving equipment, moving material around for shipment on ships. One night in March 5th, 1770, he and several of his friends went downtown to see what they could get into. At this time, the British Army was occupying Boston, and there were British troops everywhere, including British sentries in front of the British Army headquarters. Crispus Attucks and his friends decided to throw snowballs at them, and they did. Pretty soon the snowballs became rocks. Pretty soon others joined in on the rioting. The British troops were threatened and fired into the crowd. 5 were killed. Crispus Attucks was the first. He is considered to be the first man killed in the American Revolution. Throughout the American Revolutionary War, the Continental Army was an integrated force. Approximately 10 to 15% of the Continental Army, both in the Northern Theater and the Southern Theater, were made up of African Americans. There were approximately 9,000 African Americans who served in the Continental Army. The British Army also recruited African Americans, and approximately 20,000 served on the side of the British, not necessarily in frontline combat, but in support roles. And the reason for that was, through several proclamations, the British Army offered freedom in exchange for service. The image you're looking at now is the surrender of Lord Cornwallis in 1781 toward the end of the American Revolution. And I bring this up because the surrender required that the American forces line up on one side of the road, the French forces line up on the other side of the road, as the French helped the Americans at this time of the war. The surrendering British Army marched out of Yorktown between the French and the Americans. Interestingly, there is a diary written by a French officer who was standing watching the Continental American forces line up on the other side of the road. And he made the comment in his diary that approximately 1 in 4 of every American soldier was an African American. We're now looking at the United States ship Constitution. The USS Constitution, a frigate, was one of 6 ships ordered by the American Navy after the American Revolution. She was launched in 1797. She's still afloat today, is headquartered in Boston. She is the flagship of the 1st Naval District. Today, she is crewed by 66 naval personnel. In her heyday, during the War of 1812, she was crewed by over 450 men. And throughout her career, anywhere from 7% to 15% of those serving on the USS Constitution were African Americans. The USS Constitution fought in 7 actions throughout its lifetime. It was never defeated. It captured or sunk 5 British ships during the War of 1812. And interestingly, later in her career, she seized a slave ship off the coast of Africa in 1853. We have a lot of records about the USS Constitution, and I want to point out 2 sailors who served on the Constitution during the battle with the HMS Guerriere. One was Jesse Williams. He was an African American. He signed on the Constitution as an able seaman. His other job was to be the sponger for the crew of the number 3 long gun on the gun deck. He fought with that gun during the fight with the HMS Guerriere. At the end of that fight, the Constitution returned to Boston Harbor, and Jesse Williams was transferred to Lake Erie to serve with Oliver Hazard Perry in an attempt to beat the British dominance on Lake Erie. He fought at the Battle of Put in Bay, was lightly wounded. Then, when he recovered, he was sent back to the Blue Water Navy along the East Coast. He served on another ship in the USS fleet and was captured by the British. He spent the rest of the war in Dartmoor Prison in England. A second sailor I would tell you about, another African American who served on the Constitution, also served as an ordinary seaman, but he was also a skilled carpenter. So during the battle with the Guerriere, he spent his time repairing damage from the cannon rounds of the Guerriere. At the end of that battle, he too was transferred to Lake Erie to serve with Oliver Hazard Perry, and he was killed at the Battle of Lake Erie in Put in Bay. I want to move to the end of the War of 1812. Understand that this topic is so huge, so we have to move quickly. But I want to talk a few minutes about the Battle of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans was fought in 1815 after the treaty was signed ending the War of 1812, but they had not heard about it yet in the Americas. So the British had an army of 8,000 men to assault and capture the city of New Orleans. Andrew Jackson was charged with defeating the British and keeping them from capturing the city. He only had a few American regular troops, not enough to stand up to the 8,000 British regulars. He had to build an army. He threw together an army which included pirates, Native Americans, and 900 African Americans, including a battalion of African Americans that was formed in New Orleans, and it was called the Louisiana Battalion of Free Men of Color. During the American Civil War, approximately 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army, in addition to 19,000 who served in the Union Navy. Of those 199,000, 10,000 died in battle, 30,000 died from disease. The image you're looking at is Company E of the 4th U.S. Colored Infantry in Fort Lincoln, Kansas, November of 1865. For these men, the war is over. At the end of the Civil War, they needed to find somewhere to go, and many African Americans stayed with the Army because it had such an attraction. But before we go to that, I want to talk more about the Civil War itself. The next image you're looking at is the assault on Fort Wagner by the 54th Massachusetts. This is the regiment that the movie Glory was filmed about. The assault on Fort Wagner was very, very significant in the history of the 54th Massachusetts, but more importantly, in the history of African Americans' involvement in the American Civil War. The battle took place on July 18th, 1863. The 54th Massachusetts was under the command of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who was an aristocrat from Boston. He had under his command 600 men of the 54th. Fort Wagner was a defensive fort around the port of Charleston. If Fort Wagner fell, the port of Charleston would fall. So it was very important for the Confederates not to let Fort Wagner fall. When Colonel Shaw and the 54th Massachusetts assaulted the fort, they were not the only regiment in the attack, but they were the lead regiment. During that fight, Colonel Shaw was killed. 53 members of the 54th were killed outright. 149 were wounded. 67 were missing without any further word and were assumed to have been killed. The regiment lost 270 men out of 600. If you look at the image, you'll note at the crest of the fort, holding the flag, a man waving that flag is probably William H. Kearny. Sergeant Kearny was not the original color bearer of the 54th. Sergeant Bell was, but Sergeant Bell was killed on the assault. And Sergeant Kearny ran forward and picked up the flag and carried it forward. When the 54th was repulsed, he retreated by himself with the flag alone. He was wounded 5 times in the process, but made it back to his regiment. He handed the flag over to the now commanding officer of the regiment and said, "Sir, the flag never touched the ground." William H. Kearny is the first African American to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. The 54th was one of the first black regiments, and their assault on Fort Wagner was so very important for the recruitment of further African American regiments. The newspapers all throughout the North heralded the assault on Fort Wagner, and it paid off and led to the recruitment of 199,000 African Americans that served in our American Civil War. You're now looking at another image, and this is from the film Glory, and it shows the 54th assaulting Fort Wagner from left to right. Interestingly, all that has disappeared because of the actions of the Atlantic Ocean. Fort Wagner is now underwater down there. And when this occurred, In reality, the 54th assaulted from the right. So these men are assaulting the fort in the wrong direction. The next image you're going to be looking at is a monument in Boston, Massachusetts, executed by Augustus St. Gaudens. And it is the monument to Colonel Robert Shaw in the 54th Massachusetts. We do not have to go very far from Massillon, however, to find a Congressional of Honor winner during the American Civil War. Robert Pinn was a farmer in the Massillon area when the war started, and he wanted to join the Army, very patriotic. He tried to join the 13th Ohio that was being raised here in Massillon, but was not accepted. He had to wait until after the Emancipation Proclamation, and when that happened, he quickly joined the 5th U.S. Colored Infantry. His participation with the 5th U.S. found him in 1864 at the Siege of Petersburg. Specifically, he was assigned with the 5th U.S. Colored Infantry and other regiments to assault an entrenched position at Chaffin's Farm. It required them to advance over half a mile of open ground, and they did so. All the company officers in Robert Pinn's company were either killed or wounded, leaving Robert Pinn as first sergeant in command of the company, and he assumed command. He was wounded 3 times while leading that assault of his company of the 5th U.S. Colored Infantry. He refused to leave the field even though he was wounded and continued leading his assault. For his actions that day, Robert Pinn received the Congressional Medal of Honor, one of 25 issued during the American Civil War to African Americans. After the war, Pinn came home. He went to Oberlin College and became an attorney, and was an attorney throughout the rest of his lifetime here in Massillon. After the American Civil War was over, as I mentioned earlier, many black troops wanted to stay with the Army. It was a good life for them. So 4 regiments were organized out of African American troops, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and the 25th Infantry. And these 4 regiments were sent west to work in the various forts, all the way from North Dakota to Oklahoma, from Kansas to Oregon. They fought in the Indian Wars. They fought later in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. And the image you're looking at now, Buffalo Soldiers. These were the Buffalo Soldiers, so named by the Native Americans. And the images you're looking at, there are 2 of the Buffalo Soldiers. In both of those images, you can see that they fought also in the Spanish-American War. Both images were taken in Cuba. They fought at San Juan Hill. They also fought in the Philippines during the Philippine insurrection from 1899 to 1913. And in 1916, African-American units fought in the Mexican punitive expedition against Pancho Villa. I'd like to tell you about one of those men. His name is Colonel Charles Young. Charles Young was born a slave. His parents were slaves in Kentucky. They escaped slavery and crossed the river into Ohio. His father joined the Union Army and fought with the Union Army for the rest of the war. He was able to buy a farm after the war and bought a farm in Ripley, Ohio, near Cincinnati. Charles Young grew up there in Ripley, Ohio. He went to an all-white high school and graduated in 1880. He then was appointed to West Point in 1884, graduating from West Point in 1889. Now a junior officer in the United States Army, he was assigned to positions in both the 9th and 10th Cavalries out west. Later, he was assigned to teach military science back here in Ohio again at Wilberforce College. Interestingly, at that period of time, the new National Park Service was under the guidance of the U.S. military. And for a while, Charles Young was assigned to be the superintendent of Sequoia National Park. He also, in his career, served in the Philippine insurrection, was assigned to be military attaché to the country of Haiti, later military attaché to Liberia. He served in the Mexican Punitive Expedition, was the commander of the 9th Cavalry in 1916, and led one of the final cavalry charges in U.S. American military history during the Mexican Punitive Expedition. He was an author. He wrote the book Military Morale of Nations and Races, and was on assignment in Nigeria in 1922 as a colonel when he died of a kidney infection. Colonel Charles Young was the very first African American to be given military honors. His funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery in the amphitheater there, and he is today buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Colonel Charles Young, a Buffalo soldier. During World War I, there were approximately 380,000 African Americans who served in the U.S. Army. And if you look at the image, you're looking at the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry Regiment on parade. The Harlem Hellfighters were part of the American Expeditionary Force assigned to the 92nd Division. They were sent overseas. The entire 92nd Division was assigned to French command. The Americans wanted to keep all American troops under American command, but the French, in desperate need of troops and reinforcement, insisted on help. So the 92nd and 93rd Divisions, both African American divisions, were assigned to the French. The 92nd Division spent 191 days in the trenches along the Western Front. They fought heavily in the Meuse-Argonne offensive that ended the First World War. And the 92nd and 93rd Divisions throughout those months in the Western Front suffered over 5,000 killed and wounded. Many, many individual and unit honors were awarded. The second image that you're looking at of the Harlem Hellfighters is in 1919 when they've come home from the war. And these gentlemen who are sitting here all are wearing their Croix de Guerre, which is the highest French medal that you could win. And it is for distinguished service and gallantry in action, awarded to these members of the Harlem Hellfighters by the French government. The last image I want you to look at of the Hellfighters is a painting by Charles McBarron that illustrates the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th, in action in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. During the Second World War, approximately 1 million African Americans served, and they served in all theaters of the war: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Western Europe, and in the Pacific, throughout the Pacific. They served primarily in service units, but those service units were extremely important. If you look at this first image, it is of the Red Ball Express. It's a truck convoy in France. After the Normandy landings on D-Day, June 6, 1944, the advancing armies had to be supplied constantly, tons of supply constantly, food, ammunition, and gasoline to keep the tanks and the trucks running as they moved against the Germans toward the east. And the more successful the fighting was in pushing the Germans back, the more supplies they needed from the west coast of France. They had to set up a supply route to supply these troops. Several were set up. One was the Red Ball Express. These were truck convoys that traveled from the coast of France to the Army supply depots behind the front lines. The trucks ran 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The drivers of those trucks were all African American troops. Very important people. The second image of the Red Ball Express is, I picked it particularly because it's a fuel convoy. The gasoline was so very important. We can't talk about World War II and African Americans in World War II without talking about the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen were the 332nd Expeditionary Operations Group. There were 922 pilots trained as fighter pilots. Throughout their actions in Europe, 66 were killed and 32 were captured. But they destroyed 243 enemy aircraft. They flew out of North Africa and southern Italy, and their primary purpose was to escort bombing raids against Germany, Romania, and Austria. There are still 11 members of the Tuskegee Airmen alive today, and if you look at the second image, they're quite popular, they're quite famous. For years they did many presentations. You're looking at 3 of them here saluting comrades past. Tuskegee Airmen. I can't leave without mentioning an occurrence that happened in the Pacific. It happened on the island of Pele during the island hopping operations to take over the Pacific and defeat the Japanese. The Marines landed at Pele and the Japanese fought them fiercely. There were 3 African American units that also served on Pele. They were the 11th Marine Depot Company, the 7th Marine Ammunition Company, and the 17th Special Naval Construction Battalion. One night on Pele, the Japanese decided to launch an all-out assault against the Americans, and they did so, and Americans died. They were almost overwhelmed. The African Americans from these 3 units were asked to carry ammunition to the front lines and carry wounded back from the front lines, and they did that for hours. But as the Japanese assault grew more intense, it became impossible to hold them off. And the African Americans from these 3 units jumped in the foxholes and fought along with the other Marines to repel that Japanese assault. One last thing I would mention about African Americans in Europe. My father fought in North Africa, in Italy, during the Second World War. He was a member of the 751st Tank Battalion. At one point in Italy, his tank battalion was assigned to the 92nd Division, which was the African American Infantry Division in Italy, and fought very hard there. Something very, very important happened in the history of African Americans in the military on July 26, 1948. At that point, President Harry S. Truman signed an executive order that integrated all military units in all branches of service. From that point forward, African Americans would not be serving in the military in separate units, just like they had done in the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. They would fight in integrated units throughout the American military henceforth. The first war that they fought in, that was impacted by, was the Korean conflict. 600,000 African Americans served in the Korean War. 5,000 died in that war. They fought in every major battle of the Korean War, on the ground and in the air, serving as fighter pilots. They fought at the Chosin Reservoir, at Pusan, the Incheon landings, Fort Chop Hill. And they fought beside the regular Marines and the white troops, and integrated units. Time is short. There's so much to cover. There's so many stories. For every historical incident in military history or any history, every person who takes place or took an action in that incident has a different perspective, a different reality, a different story. There is absolutely no way that you can cover them all. But you can go out and you can find these stories. You can research these stories. You can look up your own ancestry and your own genealogy and find out what relatives you had fought in all these various wars. I'm right now at the Vietnam War, and we're looking at soldiers on patrol in Vietnam. 300,000 African Americans served in the Vietnam War. Over 7,000 died in that war. It is our longest war from 1961 until 1975. But that's not the end of the story. African Americans also fought in Grenada. They fought in Panama. They fought in the First Gulf War. They fought in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, Syria, and other actions that the American military is taking today. We're looking at an image of 3 soldiers. It's a statue. It's part of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. The last image I want you to look at here is an image of Brigadier General Benjamin Davis. He is a very important man. He fought in the Spanish-American War, the Philippine Insurrection, World War I, and World War II. He is the first African American to be commissioned a general. And he was commissioned by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in 1940. His son, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., was the first African American to be commissioned a general in the United States Air Force. And Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. Since the commission of Brigadier General Benjamin Davis, there have been 400 African Americans who have served in the military as a general officer. We've had 2 who have served as Secretary of Defense, and we have had a Commander-in-Chief of the military who was African American. Today, over 30% of the military are African American. Very important people in our history. And I have one more thing I'd like to say to you this afternoon before we end. Maybe life is just practice for a better world. Maybe our lives today are primary school where we learn our lessons and earn our graduation, and we can advance to a much more beautiful and better world. I don't know. You know, there's a big black granite wall in Washington, D.C. It's on the National Mall. It's down by the Lincoln Memorial. On that black granite wall, there are over 58,000 names carved. And of course, you know what wall I'm speaking of. It's the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall. There are no carvings beside those names that indicate rank or branch of service. There are no etched icons beside those names that indicate religious belief. There are no words carved in that black stone beside those names that say, he was white, he was black. Just 58,000 Americans who never came home. I have to think that if some of those 58,000 were returned today, they'd have 2 things to say to us. The first thing would be, if this life is practice, if this life is primary school for a better world, we are very slow learners. The second thing they would say, human blood, when spilled on the ground, is only red. I don't know. Someday, each of us will come to the day when we will learn what it is to die. Hopefully, we will have learned our lessons well and earned our graduation to that better world. And when we cross over into that more beautiful world, we'll reach up and we'll take off the life masks that we have been wearing our entire lives, just to discover that we all only have been the color of humanity. Until then, until that day, we each have to make a life for ourselves in this world and at this time. We cannot do that by the color of our skin. We can only do that with what we find from within. Thank you.